Sitting abandoned, hidden in thick brush along the side of an Alaskan highway is the remains of one of the largest vehicles ever made. And I've travelled thousands of miles to try and find it.
Here it is! The Alaska Freight Line's VC-22 turn train, or Sno-Freighter as it's known. There's that original LeTourneau logo. Oh, got it. Oh, well, after a lot of clambering, we've managed to get inside. And it's actually far better preserved than I was expecting. I've always wanted to see this.
At almost 280 feet long, boasting 24 huge individually driven wheels and a command car with living space for her 4-man crew, the LeTourneau VC-22 Sno-Freighter was a pioneer, a diesel-electric monster designed for transporting materials into the deep Arctic North, and part of a series of huge, unique trackless trains built by the LeTourneau company that now sit forgotten or abandoned and scattered all across North America.
There she is. Oh, last year, for my honeymoon, I dragged my wife all the way into the middle of the desert to go visit the TC-497, the largest overland vehicle ever made, certainly at the time. Now, I've dragged her all the way up to Alaska. We've just crawled through the mosquito-ridden brush to try and find another of LeTourneau's abandoned overland trains. And, amazingly, we managed to find one.
This was a massive journey, not just the planning and preparation that went into it, but just travelling all the way from my little island here on the Isle of Raasay in Scotland to Alaska to track down the last remnants of LeTourneau's overland vehicles. And it wouldn't have been possible without help from today's sponsor, Odoo, who also offer the most intuitive and customizable platform anywhere in the world for managing your business or for creating your website. Odoo can transform the way that you run your business with an app library that covers everything from accounting and timekeeping to point of sale, work planning, and more. I use Odoo to do everything from creating invoices to running our little small coffee shop and gallery here on Raasay, or just for writing and planning this very video. But perhaps my most favourite feature is Odoo's amazing open source website builder. I'm currently using this to create a new portfolio website, mainly for my photography, but especially for documenting our trip to Alaska and the history of these unique overland trains. Odoo's website builder is powerful, intuitive, and unbelievably customizable. It really distills down the creation process into something that really lets you create exactly what you want, whether that's something simple or complex or just clean and beautiful. As you can see, I use Odoo for a lot, and I think you'll see the benefits too. So try Odoo for yourself. The first application is free for life with unlimited hosting and support. What's more, build your own website hassle-free with Odoo and get free website hosting for life and a free custom domain for an entire year. Check the link in the description below, and thanks again for your support, Odoo. And I can't believe I'm really saying this, but let's get back to Alaska.
What was once the impassable Arctic now provides the quickest routes for attack from a wide sector of Europe and Asia.
In 1954, the United States and Canada came together to undertake in one of the largest building projects in the history of the world, a vast line of early warning radar stations that stretched across the Arctic to pre-warn against a potential Soviet attack from the north.
Starting at the northernmost tip of Alaska, it would stretch 3,000 miles across the continent to Baffin Island, opposite Greenland. Distant Early Warning Line, they named it. Dew Line, it became.
Building such a colossal network would require the movement of hundreds upon thousands of tons of material and supplies into some of the most remote and inhospitable regions on Earth, and within brief windows during the spring and summer when waterways were free of ice and overland travel was at least possible. Hearing of this project and realizing the scale of work that was required was Al Gezi Jr., a well-known Alaskan trucking and transport pioneer who saw an opportunity. As the Fairbanks Daily News Miner reported, Gezi secured a make-or-break deal with the government to assist in the construction of the Jew Line. His company, Alaska Freight Lines, would make an initial haul of 500 tons of materials needed for the build some 400 miles deep into the uncharted Arctic, with his crews building an overland highway as they went. It was a risky venture, and not just for the scale of work involved. As the paper reported, Alaska Freight Lines would use its own funds for the entire project and would not be paid for the freight haulage until the final delivery was made. To even have a chance of fulfilling such an ambitious contract, Gezi would need more than just conventional trucks, bulldozers and tractors, and so he turned to R.G. LeTourneau. Robert Gilmore LeTourneau had made his name and a vast fortune through his ingenious and unique machinery that could solve pretty much any problem that you could think of. Need to move vast amounts of earth and rock? Take your pick. Want to put a gun on it? Not a problem. Drilling for oil? We'll make you an oil rig. Need to crush an entire forest, you say? Enter the tree crusher. What about constructing a house? Well, the LeTourneau house machine has you covered for that. But what if I wanted to transport hundreds of tons of material overland through the Arctic using a trackless train powered by electric hub motors? Well, look, you're not going to believe this, but from the early 1950s, LeTourneau's company had been experimenting with the concept of trackless trains, huge, oversized transport vehicles powered by one of LeTourneau's most important inventions, his turn-a-torque electric motors. These motors could be fitted to individual wheels and all powered off a central onboard generator, giving vast amounts of torque but also adaptability to designs. In December 1954, Al Gezi visited LeTourneau's plant in Longview, Texas, to see the original VC-12 turn-a-train concept and its viability for Alaska. The US government, which had deep ties to LeTourneau's company, encouraged Gezi to invest in the idea, and Al Gezi placed a $75,000 down payment to begin construction of what would become known as the VC-22 Sno-Freighter. The Sno-Freighter would consist of a control car and 5 cargo cars. Each cargo car was capable of carrying around 25 tons, and each of the 24 7-foot-tall wheels would be powered by hub motors run off 2 400-horsepower Cummins diesel engines located in the control car and creating a combined 800 horsepower. The control car would also function as a living space for a crew and could be heated and insulated from the extreme cold of the Arctic. LeTourneau, well known for their rapid fabrication and prototyping, began construction of the Sno-Freighter at a feverish pace, with the huge vehicle rolled out and ready for testing by the 17th of February 1955. Almost as soon as the Sno-Freighter was operational, it was painted in the distinctive Alaska Freight Lines livery and made ready for shipping north. The 5 cargo cars, as well as the huge control cab, were trained, shipped and trucked all the way from Longview, Texas to Alaska, where in Circle, some 50 miles north of the Arctic Circle, it was reassembled and made ready for the convoy. On its journey north, carrying mainly barrels of fuel for the Jew stations, the Sno-Freighter certainly grabbed plenty of attention, featuring front and centre in numerous promotional materials for both LeTourneau and Alaska Freight Lines.
The first time you see the snow train at Circle City, where it's being assembled, you rub your eyes. You look closer, and there's a man with a torch heating a rim to a 7-foot 4-inch tire. Everything and everyone is dwarfed by the mechanized giant. Overall length of 250 feet, with the train consisting of a powerhouse and 5 trailers. You put down a question mark when informed every one of the 24 wheels has its very own electric motor, supplied with power totaling 1,800 horsepower in all from the diesels in the head section. 14 feet high, 16 feet wide, figures and more figures that seem exaggerated until you stand near the beast.
Certainly, as a futuristic machine of tomorrow, forging into uncharted territory and promoting both the Jew Line and LeTourneau's advanced electric drive systems, the Sno-Freighter was a grand success. But as a practical vehicle, the rushed development and untested design left a lot to be desired. The ride, owing to the almost complete lack of suspension, was incredibly rough, and the large tyres suffered numerous tears on tree stumps and branches sticking from the rough terrain. Perhaps most troublesome of all, however, the engines and generators, installed quickly and with little tolerance to flex, became misaligned and frequently broke down. However, despite these challenges, the Sno-Freighter was able to complete 2 successful resupply trips through 1955, hauling mainly large barrels of fuel to various Jew stations across hundreds of miles of Canadian and Alaskan wilderness. It would be on its 3rd trip, however, in spring of 1956, that disaster would occur. Piled high with supplies, the Sno-Freighter left Eagle, Alaska on a long and winding route east. The crew operated the Sno-Freighter in rotating shifts 24 hours a day, and on the controls that night was Luke Riley, the crew's cook. Finding himself driving downhill, Riley misjudged the length and steepness of the hill, and unfamiliar with the controls, could not figure out how to slow down the speeding Sno-Freighter, and in a desperate attempt to stop the huge machine, steered it into a snowbank, jackknifing the control car. The second trailer punctured the huge fuel tank at the rear of the control cab, and within seconds, the huge machine had ignited in flames. Following the fire, the huge Sno-Freighter was essentially dead in the water. The lack of power meant that each of its 24 electric wheels were now firmly locked in place, and without necessary parts to fix it, and already facing dire financial woes, Alaska Freight Lines were forced to leave the huge machine where it stood, until insurance adjusters could assess the damage. In 1961, another overland train, the LCC-1, or Logistical Cargo Carrier, built just after the Sno-Freighter for use by the US Army, was sent to try and recover the Sno-Freighter. They were able to limp the control car and trailers all the way back to Bear Creek, Yukon Territory, where it would eventually sit until 1968. Eventually, it would move back to Alaska, being hauled by trucks all the way to the Alaskan border, and then finally ending up in its current location alongside the Steese Highway just north of Fairbanks, where it has sat ever since. The control cab of the Sno-Freighter and its remaining trailers now lie in a corner of the Gold Daughters gold panning site, where visitors can pan for gold and explore an eclectic range of artifacts from Alaskan history. Perhaps the most distinctive sight when you arrive is not the old overland train in the bushes, but rather a Cold War geodesic dome that would have once been used on the same Jew stations that the Sno-Freighter was designed to resupply. The owners of the site were kind enough to let me track down the freighter, now hidden and overgrown with foliage and brush along the side of the highway. Having flown and driven thousands of miles, it was quite surreal walking the last few steps to finally see what was left of one of LeTourneau's most famous and forgotten overland trains.
The folks at Gold Daughters did tell me that this thing has been overgrown for a few years now. Still can't even see it. Okay, amazingly, after decades sitting out in the middle of nowhere, here it is. The Alaska Freight Lines VC-22 turn train, or Sno-Freighter as it's known. And you can still see the beautiful Alaska Freight Lines livery there. You can actually see the LeTourneau logo on the front there, LeTourneau equipment. So probably the most infamous part of the Sno-Freighter's story is the fact that it actually went on fire and burnt out. And you can see here, this is the back of the Sno-Freighter, and you can actually see the burnt out remains here. Essentially what happened was, while they were coming downhill, this thing jackknifed, and because it was going downhill, the wheels here, which are geared, were generating electricity because they're all motors, essentially. But unlike an electric car, where the motors can power the batteries or refill the batteries, the electricity and the heat has nowhere to go. When the vehicle jackknifed, it hit a fuel line and punctured it, combined the extreme heat of all the excess electricity from going downhill and the fuel lines, and the entire thing at the back went up in flames. And this is where the actual fuel tank would have been. So it was a real disaster. It's lucky the entire thing didn't burn out. Luckily, it was just the back half of the control cab, essentially. Wow. So here we are underneath one of the trailers. So there would have been the control car, and then there was 5 trailers being towed behind it. You can actually see here the LeTourneau logo. And remember, the big thing with this is each wheel had its own individual motor placed into it. So you had this wishbone suspension system that you can see here, and then suspended underneath it were 2 axles, and then 4 wheels. And each wheel had its own hub motor that could be individually powered from the engine car, the control car up front. So this is quite interesting. You can actually see somebody's taken off like the inspection plate here. You can see the internals of one of the LeTourneau motors in here. One of the most interesting thing about these LeTourneau motors, this unit here is not waterproof. The actual motors themselves are. It was one of the selling points of the LeTourneau motors. They could be submerged in water or mud or sand and they would still operate. It was this ruggedness that the LeTourneau company used as the selling point essentially for these being the overland, all weathers, all environments, kind of extreme machines of the future. Wow. Ugh. I have always wanted to see this. This here is what the inside of one of the LeTourneau Torque or LeTourneau motors looked like. The electric motors that were fitted to each of the wheels that would power them. Now, these here are actually the reduction gears. There's another ring at the back there, and then the motor itself was recessed behind that, inside the kind of axle itself. But this gives you an idea of basically how this worked. Each motor individually powering each wheel, giving it an, in theory, unprecedented level of maneuvering and torque, and being able to move off with an extremely heavy weight from a standstill. You can actually see one of the gears there is broken. I think that was done when they were trying to maneuver these trailers, because when these things were seized and broken after the fire, they were almost impossible to move. So they had to basically break each of these gears to get them moving so that they could freewheel these things out of, well, I think it was Circle or Fox, where the trailer and the actual control car had been stranded for years after the fire. So there's the control car up there. If we go under here, you can see a few interesting features. The most important one being this. This here is the steering mechanism for the VC22. So essentially, much like a standard car, it had rack and pinion steering. So you can see here are the cogs here, and as you turned it, each of these would move around and turn this huge front axle, which obviously had its own motors in there as well too. So this was powered by a little generator, and I think actually if we go to the other side, aha, look, there you go. There's the other side of the rack and pinion steering, and this is the motor that would have powered and turned this huge axle. Now, the other thing you can see over here, this is the winch. They had a lot of problems with this winch. I think it broke quite quickly, but this is the large motor that powered. It was I think an AC motor. In fact, it'll be the same motor that was in this, the steering rack, and then you can see the vast winch cable. In fact, if we go round, yeah, here's a better look at the winch cable. Quite amazing.
Despite its condition, a remarkable amount of the Sno-Freighter has remained intact. 2 of its trailers are still attached, with a third nearby and what looks to be the bones of a 4th lying in the bushes. Interestingly, the trailers had been for many years repurposed as the deck for a house. Going back through historic satellite images, the house and trailers can be seen quite clearly, with the control cab parked nearby the geodesic dome. However, in the last decade or so, the trailers and cab have been collected together and now sit on their own.
Oh, got it. Oh, well, after a lot of clambering, we've managed to get inside. And it's actually far better preserved than I was expecting. So this is the control cab. The control cabin being obviously the cockpit here for driving. And then, as you can see, 2 bunks, which still survive. I don't know if this is the original mattress and covers, but this is the sleeping compartment, because like the TC497, this was the first iteration of it. There was actually a sleeping compartment for up to 4 crew, although the entire thing could be operated just by a single crew member. And then you would pass through this door, and in the back here is where the engine room was. Now remember, of course, this all burnt away during the fire, but this is where the engine room was, along with the generators that produced all the power for the 24 wheels and wheel motors. You can see the remains of cables that once would have ran up to the control station, I imagine, at the front there. That's all been cut when the engines and everything were removed. You can also see here, this is clearly the insulation that was behind this door, on the inside of this door. I think the entire cabin, but behind both the aluminium and the wooden panels, all had a layer of insulation. Probably some horrendously toxic asbestos, no doubt. can actually see here the exhausts and maybe the air intakes for the engines up here. They've just been cut off, but these would have been sticking out the top. You can see obviously this once was a domed roof that has now been staved in by the fire. Up to the cockpit. You can see the rat's nest of cabling in there. Again, quite a simple system though in many ways. We're missing obviously the controls up here on the top. That's been long since removed. But that is it. There's nothing else. To control this entire vast machine, there was a bank of dials that big, and then all of this was just basically spare space. I love the fact that you have the window wipers still on this. To this very day, all these years later, the rubber from the window wipers is still there. It's absolutely crazy actually climbing inside and seeing this thing, especially because unlike the TC497 down in Yuma, which has basically remained in a state of perfect preservation down there in the desert, this thing has sat open to the elements up here in Alaska for decades at this point. And you guys know me as well. If there's one thing that links my videos, it's living spaces. I'm fascinated by them. And, you know, coming up here, I didn't quite expect to find what must be the original beds that could have been utilized for the 2 crew members, or out of the 4, to sleep in as this thing was operating. And I think when you look at this, and you look at this interesting raised cockpit that they have built, it reminds me of a couple of things. One, it reminds me of the Kharkovchanka, the Soviet overland vehicle that had a very similar sort of control station at the front with a living space at the back. But it reminds me a lot of the TC497. It's actually amazing how much of the original design ideas for this, the VC22, carried over to the eventual TC497, especially when you compare the control cars like this. This thing looks very simple, but when you look closely, it's the exact idea of the TC497, a prototype version. You have this raised position where you can see not just out the front, but also the sides and the rear looking back down the length of the train. And then as you move back, you have your crew compartment, a lot more simple in the VC22. And then at the back there, the engine room, similar again in that layout to the final iteration of the overland train. But yeah, while this thing maybe doesn't look like much, I'm amazed about how much has been preserved. The paint is still in the walls, the beds, the control station, the amazing unique chairs, they're all still here. It's actually quite amazing just how much of it has survived. And yeah. It's also important to keep in mind that the Sno-Freighter, despite its reputation as being a white elephant stranded in various places for decades around Yukon Territory in Alaska, was at least somewhat successful. Now, that success was limited to a very small window of time in which it made about 2 or 3 due resupply runs before catastrophically catching on fire, but it did work. I should also point out I'm no longer in Yukon Territory or Alaska. I'm back home leaning on my tractor in my garage. I'm actually working on my new Hilux Surf, or Forerunner to those of you out in America. God, isn't she beautiful? I'm not going to get distracted. I've got to stick on topic. But the concept of the overland train in something like the TC497 never really progressed beyond the testing stage down in Yuma. But both the Snow Train, built for the US Army, now located in Yukon, and the Sno-Freighter, built for Alaska Freight Lines, did work. They made it to Alaska, they made it to the places they were designed to go to. And I think in the case of the Sno-Freighter, it would have continued to be used somewhat successfully to resupply the due stations had it not been for that gigantic fire, which I know is a lot to say. I think though the thing that would have really ended the Sno-Freighter and its role in Alaska Freight Lines would be the financials of Alaska Freight Lines themselves. I mentioned that Alaska Freight Lines and Al Ghezi had organized this make-or-break deal with the US government. Well, it really broke Alaska Freight Lines. The immense amount of financial cost it was taking for them to move these materials up to these due stations outweighed any possible profit margin. And within a few years, they had been reorganized and then basically went bankrupt as a result of this massive undertaking. And the Sno-Freighter did not help. Let's make one thing clear. It was a massive loss to them to lose such a massive piece of equipment that they could have used in moving these supplies, but also the immense amount of financial burden that they had undertaken in building the Sno-Freighter. Now, I'm going to refer to the book I always refer to. I would heavily recommend, as I have said in numerous times before in numerous videos, this book, R.G. LeTourneau's Overland Trains by my friend Mark Boer. You can see how dog-eared mine has become, but Mark has such amazing extra information, way more than I could ever cover in a video, about the entire Overland Trains project, all the way from its early beginnings and the early concept Turner trains all the way up to the TC497. And, you know, I can't thank him enough for all the help he's given me over the years in researching this topic. So to pay me back and him back, please support him and this amazing tome of work by purchasing one of these books. I'll leave a link in the description below. But in his chapter about the Sno-Freighter, he talks about how Al Ghezi and his friend John Clark, who was his business partner and another kind of famous figure in Alaskan trucking history, they travelled down to Longview to view Turner trains, the concept Turner trains and the viability for it in Alaska. And the money involved was quite mind-blowing. To quote Mark Moore's book here, LeTourneau needed $75,000 to start the construction of the Sno-Freighter, which Al Ghezi sent over. The total cost of the machine was $450,000, almost $500,000 in 1950s dollars to build the Sno-Freighter, just the Sno-Freighter. And Mark goes into more detail in his book, but you know, the LeTourneau company and the US government had very, very deep ties. At the time that this was happening, they were in the process of building the Snow Buggy, which was built for the US Army, also the Snow Train. They obviously would build the massive TC497 as well too. LeTourneau's relationship with the US Army went all the way back to World War II when they were making, you know, basically all the earth-moving equipment for the US Army. So there was deep ties, and the impression is that Al Ghezi was kind of, you know, nodding a wink by the US Army, the US government rather. Look, if you support LeTourneau and you invest in this project, we will make sure that the Alaska Freight Line's contract to resupply the juice stations works. And of course, in the end, it didn't really work. And John Clark, who I mentioned there, Al Ghezi's business partner in Alaska Freight Lines, was very dubious of the Sno-Freighter, as were a lot of people involved at the time. The rush development and the speed of the development, I think, shocked and worried Alaska Freight Lines because they didn't really get any time to feed in any of their recommendations, and things that they could see were clearly not going to work on the up in Alaska were being implemented and designed into this rushed Sno-Freighter design. There's actually quite a damning account by John Clark, who was sent down to Longview to try and at least help oversee or guide some of the construction of the overland train, and he was not successful. To quote Mark Moore, by the time Clark made it down to Longview, the Sno-Freighter design was already complete and fabrication was underway. The longer he was there, the worse the machine appeared to Clark. In a letter to Al Ghezi, Clark stated that the Sno-Freighter was, quote, about the most impractical gadget that I had ever had the misfortune to encounter. So, you know, John Clark called it, and I believe it was John Clark that went up to assess whether the Sno-Freighter could be recovered after the fire. And I mean, it was realized quite quickly, I think, that it was fruitless. And again, they were under pretty dire financial straits by that point anyway. But yes, an incredible story told in far more detail than I could ever manage in Mark Moore's incredible book, R.G. LeTourneau's Overland Trains, which again, I would highly recommend. I'll leave a link in the description below. But man, I'm still somewhat in shock about it all, about the fact that we managed to do this once-in-a-lifetime trip to track down the VC-22. Big thanks to the Gold Daughters, who kindly were willing to let this strange Scottish man who emailed them out the blue to say, look, I'm flying over from Scotland, can I come and film the big abandoned vehicle at the very back of your yard? And they were like, yeah, of course. I never actually got the chance to meet them, but I would love to get back out to Alaska again. I mean, if you guys are ever in and around Fairbanks, Gold Daughters, the site is worth visiting. There's obviously the Sno-Freighter. It's not kind of on main display though. And again, I would reiterate not to climb on it or vandalize it or anything like that. You know, I got permission from the owners to visit there. But their site has loads of other really interesting stuff. That amazing geodesic dome from the juice station. You can actually pan for gold there, which is a really fun thing. We saw a lot of kids there and like grandparents who were clearly taking their kids out for like a day out, which is really nice. But there's really interesting parts of Alaskan history and mining history, because that whole area around Fairbanks is very rich in Alaskan mining history and culture. But yeah, truly amazing. So big thanks to them. Big thanks obviously to my patrons. I told them weeks and weeks ago about this plan to do this. If you actually follow me on Instagram, instagram.com/calmrassay or patreon.com/calmrassay, I was documenting it on there. Incredible time. I mean, you don't need me to tell you that Alaska and Yukon are just some of the most incredible, amazing places. And, you know, it's all thanks to you guys for watching these videos and supporting me. And hopefully, next video, it might be the next video, or at some point I will have the final in the Overland Trains quadrilogy, because there is the original video, the TC497 video, this one, the VC22, and then the final one, the LCC1 video on the last overland train over there in Yukon. But until then, I can't wait to show you that. I am going to go off now, work on my tractor for a bit, work on my beautiful new truck, and I'll see you guys in the next one. So, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.